This is my restored Yokomo YZ10 Super Dogfighter. For those who aren't terribly familiar with the YZ10, Yokomo started making these in the late 1980s. Their first model was called the 870C, which is this model right here. And then after that, they made various upgrades for the If More Worlds every other year. So they had the 89 Works model, the 91 Works, the 93 Works, the 94 YZ10, which was a totally different design with the exception of the rear bulkhead. The rear bulkhead is the same for every single YZ10. And then that 94 YZ10, they made updates to that, like the 95 Pavitas edition, and then I think a 96 or 97 Works model, and then that was it. That was the end of the YZ10 series. So this is the first one, the 870C, and I got this for about 30 bucks on Craigslist. And it was, pretty dirty and beat up, so it just needed to be cleaned out a little bit and needed the diffs to be rebuilt and a few other things. Like, I had to get the body and the wing and the wheels and everything. So the body and wing are from Team Blue Groove. These are the 870C series body and wing. Since this YZ10 was originally made in the late 1980s, around 88, I think, or 87, thereabouts, I wanted to do sort of a late 80s kind of color scheme, which is very bright neon colors. So it's like a pink wing with, a neon bumper, neon wheels, and fluorescent coloring here on the body. These fluorescent colors, I had mentioned before in other build videos, they're rather hard to do because the fluorescent paint is very light, and if you're not careful, the paint will run. You have to do a lot of very thin coats. And so you can see a few dark spots here where the paint sort of accumulated a little bit on the body, but at least from a distance, it's not too bad. It's a decent runner body if I want to run this for the Vintage Nationals or something. Anyway, let's get into the chassis itself. Let me take this off. So I'll start with the front bumper here. This front bumper is actually not for the YZ10. It's an RPM bumper that's made for the RC10T and GT. You can get this from A-Main Hobbies. And it's about the right width for the lower deck, and you just have to trace out where the screw mounting points are for the front of the lower deck here, and just take a reamer and, drill the holes out. It mounts just fine. Okay. Going to the rear wing, I used piano wire here just to make the wing wire mounting points. These wing buttons are from Team Associated, and you just have to bend these wires around a little bit because the front of the wing slopes down, so you got to bend the wire up and back. But it seems to work okay. These shocks didn't come with the chassis. When I got the chassis, they came with even older shocks, which have a little C-clip at the bottom of the shock body where you mount the seals in, and some weird diaphragm up at the top here beneath the shock cap. So I just put those aside, and I just put on some standard Associated shocks circa early 1990s here. These are basically like version 1 shocks except without the threaded shock body. Okay. Other things that came with the chassis, which I think was a very good deal here. This has aluminum front arms and Andes rear arms. So Andes was a company that made racing components for older chassis. So these are sort of repro or reproduction rear arms. I bought another set just in case those break, but they're supposed to be very durable. So that's pretty cool. I installed turnbuckles front and rear for the camber links, for the steering. The original setup here were just flat tie rods with threaded ball studs on the inside and outside of the camber links. And so if you wanted to change camber, you'd have to pull the ball stud out, twist the ball cup in or out, and then remount it. So I just tried to do something a little more modern here. So I just have Associated ball studs, and they go through the shock tower, and then I just take a lock nut and lock them in on the other side. Seems to work okay for now. Hopefully nothing will pop out there. Let's see. These wheels are from JC Racing. They're very nice reproduction wheels. You can get them for, oops, little focus issue there. You can get these for about 9 British pounds per set. So a set of 4, I think it's around 9 British pounds. In terms of the drivetrain, it's a very simple drivetrain. Your spur gear feeds into 2 pulleys. One pulley drives the rear, one pulley drives the front. And then the diffs, the front and rear diffs, are also pulleys. And that's it. That's your entire drivetrain. Front and rear diffs are a little different from like a team associated diff. The diff balls are larger, the thrust balls are smaller. The diff balls are 3 millimeters. The thrust balls are really tiny. I don't know the exact size. But you can replace the thrust bearing setup in here with a modern associated thrust bearing setup, which has, I think, 3 32-inch thrust balls. So that, shouldn't be a problem if you happen to lose the thrust balls here. Although the diffs are very smooth, they're very nice. So I did have to take them and clean them out and use a sanding bed on a Dremel to just grind out the diff plates because they were a little rusty. What else here? The front and rear belts, you can get replacement belts from toughracing.com, I think. The rear belt fits fine. The front belt, this is actually the original front belt. The front belt that they make for this is 1 tooth too large. And it would only really work if you had the belt tensioner unit. So if you go online and you look at some other YZ10 870C models, they'll actually have like a spine that runs across the bottom of the chassis with a belt tensioner that connects to that spine and it can push the belt down. So if you run that replacement belt, you'll need that tensioner unit. I don't have a tensioner unit here, so I can't really use that replacement belt. I had to get some original Yokomo belts for the front. Spur gear here, this particular unit has a one-way bearing on the inside here, and it's integrated into the part that the spur gear mounts on. So this spur gear is actually just a modern Robinson Racing 48-pit spur gear. You can get these from anywhere. And this mounts onto, through 2 screws, a mounting unit that has a one-way bearing inside one of the drive pulleys. So what you can do is, all right, so the one-way bearing is supposed to give you more turn-in. It sort of behaves more like a 2-wheel drive car under braking, allows the front wheels to freewheel, okay, when the car's under braking. So if you don't want that kind of looseness in handling, because it does make the car very twitchy, you can basically push something up against the one-way bearing to either partially lock it up or fully lock it up, and that'll reduce the amount of freewheeling the front wheels have under braking. So what I did here is I just have a little bronze bushing with a spring, and then this is just like almost like a clamp that locks against the this shaft here, and that just pushes against the one-way bearing. Doesn't completely lock it, but it does reduce the amount of freewheeling I get. So it's sort of a partial, it's sort of halfway in between having a full one-way bearing and having full-time 4-wheel drive. So I'll try this out, and if I want a little more steering, I can just take the spring out and the bushing out and just put this little guy back in, and then I get my full one-way bearing action. The Yokomo YZ10 was known for using magnesium components, which are very light but also rather brittle. So the front bulkhead, the rear bulkhead, the front and rear, or the front steering knuckles, which are also the exact same component just flipped up for the rear hub carriers, those are all magnesium. The hubs in particular can be prone to breaking or cracking because magnesium is rather brittle. So I'll just have to test this out over time to see if I have any problems with this. My understanding is the old Kyosho Laser or Optima hubs can fit pretty well as a replacement for these. So we'll just have to see how that goes. Let's see. What else here? Nothing else that really comes to mind. Oh, right. One more thing. Sorry, I forgot. One setup option that people have done on this older 870C series YZ10 is to put rear suspension arms in the front. And that is to help reduce tire scrub. So tire scrub is what happens when you have a narrow suspension arm. If you look at my Tamiya Avanti 2011 setup series, I have a 2-part setup series for that, which on its own was incomplete, but I did talk about how the arms were rather narrow, and what happens is when those arms are narrow, as the suspension compresses, the tire follows an arc, okay? Now, if there's too much droop on the arms, the tire is actually a little bit on the inside, and so when the car lands off a jump and the suspension compresses, the initial part of that arc is for the tire to push out. So there's a lateral friction that the tire is placing on the suspension as the suspension is compressing, and that can lead to some erratic landing behavior. So if you put a wider arm on the suspension, that the radius of that arc increases, and so you get less tire scrub, as it's called. One thing you can also do to try to negate that is to just drop the ride height, because then you're starting at a different part of that arc, so you get less scrub. So I have to try to optimize the ride height here. It is a little bit on the high side, around 30 millimeters. As a reference point, the factory setup for Team Associated B44 is a 21 millimeter ride height. So this is about 10 millimeters taller in ride height than a modern buggy. So since the stock shock towers don't have many options for the mounting points, you have to adjust the ride height by using down travel limiters on the shocks if you want to drop the ride height. So I'll have to do that. Otherwise, everything is, very smooth, very nice. Let's see. In terms of width and length, the wheelbase is comparable to a modern buggy, but the width is a little smaller. Even with the wider front arms, the front and rear width is a little bit smaller than a modern buggy. It's actually comparable to my Tamiya Avante in terms of its width. So I believe that's the case up to the 93 Works chassis, maybe the 91 Works chassis. Use slightly wider arms. The 94 YZ10 has really nice wide arms, a little bit more like a modern buggy. I do have one of those. I'll make a build video or a video of that soon. But I just wanted to show you this. I want to try to use this as a runner for vintage racing. I have a Turnigy speed control and 10.5 turn brushless motor in here. Should be sufficient. I can only use 10.5 turn for vintage four-wheel drive racing. So yeah, this should be nice and quick. So that's it. I just wanted to share this with you guys, and thanks for watching.